They told me I would die in that cell, a quiet, anonymous death. The sentence wasn't just from the Iranian regime, it was from biology itself. But on the 40th day, as my heart began to falter, God intervened in a way that left my captors in a state of terrified awe. What happened in Evin Prison was not just a miracle for me, it was a message for the world. My name is Dariush Vahidi. Just a few months ago, I was a professor of literature, a man who found solace in the elegant logic of poetry and the measured rhythm of academic life. I walked the same university halls where I had once been a star student, discussing the mystic verses of Rumi that hinted at a divine love I had now come to know personally. By day, I was a respected academic. By night, I became a shepherd to a hidden flock, leading secret worship in apartments where the windows were always covered and our voices never rose above a whisper. We were teachers, students, shopkeepers, a family bound by a dangerous faith. I carried my Bible in a false compartment in my briefcase, and its weight felt heavier than every other book combined. Every day, I balanced these two worlds, the public and the profoundly private, each step measured, each word carefully chosen. I remember the last normal meal I had with my wife, the way she laughed at a simple joke, the warmth of the tea in my hands. I did not know it would be the final memory of a life that was about to be violently taken from me. The knock came on a Tuesday evening. It was not the polite tap of a neighbor. It was the hard, rapid pounding of finality, the sound of a world ending. 3 men in plain clothes stood there, their eyes empty of any human feeling. They knew my name, they knew my other name, the one I use only with my secret family of believers, Dariush Vahidi. The lead one said, his voice a flat, bureaucratic instrument. You need to come with us for a discussion. My wife's hand found mine, her grip so tight it almost hurt, a silent scream of a terror we had always feared but never dared to name. That was the last time I felt the warmth of a human touch for a very, very long time. They did not blindfold me in the car. They wanted me to see the familiar streets of my neighborhood, the shops, the faces, all fading away into the night. They wanted me to understand that the ordinary was being stripped from me, layer by layer. We drove toward a place that every Iranian knows in the pit of their stomach, Evin Prison. The building loomed against the dark mountains, a monstrous slab of concrete and silence, a machine designed to break souls. My punishment was not a quick bullet. It was a slow, deliberate erasure. For 40 days, they starved me. They watched with clinical detachment as my body consumed itself, as my mind began to cannibalize its own sanity. They were waiting for me to become a number, a file in a drawer, a lesson to others. But God had a different testimony in mind. What I learned in the absolute darkness is that when human power does the very worst it can do, that is the precise moment God reveals the greatest of what He can do. This is not just my story of starvation. This is the story of the bread from heaven that sustained me when all earthly sustenance was gone. This testimony is a single light in a very dark place. But lights can be extinguished. I am sharing this with you now at great personal risk, trusting that it will find open hearts. If you believe these stories must be heard, if you feel that pull toward a truth that transcends the worst of this world, I need you to stand with me. Subscribe to Echoes of Return now. Help me keep this light burning for all those who are still in the dark, and for whom this message might be their only hope. The processing room was a temple of dehumanization. The air was thick with the smell of stale sweat and disinfectant. They took everything. My wallet, a simple leather fold that held pictures of my wife, my belt, leaving my trousers to hang loosely. Finally, they demanded my wedding ring. I struggled to twist it off my finger, my hands trembling not from fear, but from a rising cold fury. The guard, a young man with a pock-marked face, grew impatient and yanked my hand, pulling the ring off with a force that left my skin raw. That small golden circle was the last tangible connection to my wife, to my life, to love itself. Its absence from my finger felt more violating than any blow. They cataloged each item with a bored efficiency, dropping them into a plastic bag. I was no longer Dariush Vahidi, husband, professor. I was a number, a body to be stored. They led me down a corridor of echoing footsteps and slamming steel doors. The light was a sickly yellow, flickering in some places, absent in others. We stopped at cell 307. The guard unlocked it and shoved me inside. The door closed with a finality that vibrated in my teeth. The cell was smaller than my university office. A concrete slab protruded from one wall, serving as a bed. In the corner, a hole in the floor emitted a foul odor. A single dim bulb burned behind a thick, wire-reinforced glass pane near the ceiling, casting long, distorted shadows. It never turned off. This was my world. I sat on the concrete slab, the cold seeping through my clothes immediately. I wrapped my arms around myself and began to recite the Psalms silently. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. The words felt thin, a paper shield against a crushing reality. The interrogations began the next day. They took me to a room that was startlingly clean and bright. A table, 2 chairs. And he introduced himself as Jawad. He was a small man, impeccably dressed in a press shirt, with neat hands and eyes that held no discernible emotion. He did not yell. He did not threaten. He spoke like a lecturer discussing a flawed thesis. Dariush, he began, steepling his fingers. You are an educated man. You understand systems. The state is a system, a complex living organism. Religion, particularly your imported version, is another system. You have made a critical error. You have tried to run a system within the system. This creates friction, instability. The organism must reject it. He wanted names. The names of everyone who attended our meetings. The names of those who hosted us. The sources of our Bibles. I gave him nothing but my own name and a silent prayer. For a week, this was our dance. He would present his cold logic. I would retreat behind the fortress of my faith. Then, the strategy shifted. The questions stopped. The first meal I missed was disorienting. The second day, the gnawing in my stomach became a sharp, persistent ache. On the third day, Jawad came to my cell. He did not enter. He stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the bright hall light, and observed me as one might observe a dying insect. The human body is a fascinating system, Professor, he said, his voice soft, almost conversational, so efficient, so predictable. When the fuel source is removed, it enters a conservation mode. It consumes fat reserves. Then it begins to catabolize muscle tissue for energy. The organs strain. The mind, a delicate electrochemical system, begins to degrade. It is a predictable, measurable cascade. He smiled then, a thin, cruel line that did not reach his eyes. We do not need to beat you. We do not need the messy business of electrodes or broken bones. Your body, your own biology, will do our work for us. It is the most elegant form of interrogation. We will simply wait. He closed the door. The bolt sliding home was the loudest sound I had ever heard. In that moment, I understood the true genius depth of their evil. They were not just denying me food. They had turned my own existence into my torturer. My body was no longer my own. It had become the instrument of my confession and my tomb. The first week of starvation was a physical argument, a constant nagging debate between my body and the void within it. The hunger was a sharp-toothed creature living in my stomach, gnawing at my insides with relentless insistence. My thoughts, which I had always prided on their academic discipline, began to betray me. They would not focus on prayer or scripture, but would instead conjure vivid, torturous images of food. I could smell my wife's herb-rich stew, see the golden crust of freshly baked bread, feel the sticky sweetness of a date on my tongue. I would wake from a feverish sleep, my mouth flooding with saliva, only to have the gray concrete reality of my cell rush back in, a cruel joke played by my own mind. The guards maintained their routine, their footsteps echoing in the hall, the clang of doors a symphony of my isolation. Sometimes they would slide a cup of water through the slot. This was not mercy, it was part of the torture. The inconsistency, a cup one day, nothing the next, kept me perpetually off balance, my hope flickering each time I heard a sound outside the door. By the beginning of the second week, the sharp pains began to mutate into a deep, pervasive ache that settled into my bones. It was a dull, throbbing emptiness that seemed to fill the marrow of my being. My body, a system now in full rebellion, began its cannibalistic feast. I could feel the weakness seeping into my muscles. a leaden weight making the simplest movements Herculean. Standing up from the concrete slab sent black spots dancing across my vision. Pacing the 3 steps from one wall to the other left me breathless, my heart hammering a frantic panic rhythm against my ribs. My clothes, which had already been loose, now hung off my frame like shrouds. I would run my hands over my arms and chest, feeling the sharp ridges of my ribs, the prominent knobs of my hips and collarbones. I was becoming a skeleton, wrapped in thinning skin. The physical transformation was horrifying, but the psychological unraveling was a deeper, more terrifying descent. The silence of God became a presence in the cell, heavier and more suffocating than the darkness. I tried to pray, to clutch the familiar words of the Psalms like a life raft, but they felt like meaningless sounds. They would leave my lips and seem to die in the stagnant air, falling to the floor without echo or answer. My God, why have you forsaken me? The cry of Christ on the cross was no longer a theological point. It was the raw, screaming truth of my own soul. I was alone. Truly, utterly alone. Had my faith been a delusion? A comfortable story I told myself in a comfortable life? Here, in the extreme reality of Evin Prison, that story was crumbling to dust and I was crumbling with it. The fortress of my mind, which I had believed was built on rock, was proving to be made of sand, and the tide of despair was washing it away. The thirst was a special kind of hell. The hunger was a monster, but the thirst was a demon. My mouth felt perpetually full of dust and wool. My tongue swelled, becoming a thick foreign object that stuck to the roof of my mouth. My lips cracked and bled, the metallic taste a cruel substitute for moisture. I spent hours, entire cycles of the light and dark, fantasizing about water, not just drinking it, but being submerged in it. I dreamed of cool, clear streams of rain on my face, of the condensation beating on a cold glass. The memory of the last glass of water I had taken for granted in my kitchen became a tormenting icon of a lost paradise. The guards' infrequent water deliveries became the central events of my existence. The sound of the slot opening would send a jolt of electric hope through my broken body. I would scramble for the cup, my hands shaking so violently I would spill half of it, lapping at the precious liquid like a dog, the wetness on the floor a tragedy. This was the system Javad had described, working with flawless, brutal efficiency. I was being reduced not to an animal, but to something even more primitive, a single, desperate need. Then the true darkness began to descend. Near the end of the 3rd week, the hallucinations started. They began subtly. The shadows in the corner of my cell would shift and coalesce, forming shapes that almost looked like a person. I jerked my head, and they would dissolve back into nothing. But soon, they grew more substantial. I saw my wife, Laleh, standing by the door, her face sad and pale. I had long, detailed conversations with her, telling her I was sorry, that I loved her, begging her to forgive me for leaving her alone. I heard my mother's voice, singing an old lullaby from my childhood. The sounds were so clear, so real, that I would answer them aloud. My voice, a dry, rasping croak that shattered the illusion. I knew, on some level, that it was my mind breaking, that the electrochemical system Javad had so coldly referenced was now misfiring, creating phantom companions to stave off the unbearable solitude. But the knowing didn't help. The visions felt real. The voices felt real. And the crushing loneliness that followed their disappearance was the most real thing of all. I was losing my grip on reality, and the world was dissolving into a nightmare from which I could not wake. A new, different pain began to bloom deep within me, a low, burning ache in my lower back that refused to be ignored. It was not the sharp pain of a muscle strain, but a deep, visceral throbbing that felt like it was emanating from my very core. At first, I tried to dismiss it as another phantom sensation from my disintegrating mind, but it persisted and grew. Within a day, I noticed my ankles and feet were swelling. The skin stretched tight and shiny, and when I pressed a finger into the flesh, the indentation remained, a tiny pit of despair. The few times I was able to urinate, the liquid was a dark, ominous brown, the color of strong tea. A cold, clinical understanding cut through the haze of my hunger. My kidneys were shutting down. The very organs designed to filter the poisons from my blood were now drowning in them. This was the predictable cascade Javad had described with such detached confidence. The system was failing just as he said it would. The knowledge was a final, heavy stone placed upon my chest. The despair that followed was absolute. It was no longer a feeling, but a state of being. A thick black tar that filled my lungs and coated my thoughts. My faith felt like a childhood fantasy, a story I told myself, to make the vast, empty universe less frightening. Here, in the crushing reality of my cell, there was no God. There was only physics and chemistry and biology. There was only the inevitable, unfeeling process of a body breaking down into its component parts. The prayers stopped entirely. There were no more words left, only the raw, silent scream of a creature being unmade. I stopped pacing. I stopped even sitting up. I curled onto my side on the cold concrete slab, drawing my knees to my chest in a futile attempt to conserve what little warmth I had left. The hallucinations became my only reality. I was no longer in a prison cell. I was in a boat, adrift on a black, endless sea, and the boat was sinking. The final surrender was not dramatic, it was a quiet letting go. There was no more fight, no more resistance. The last flicker of my will to live sputtered and died. I accepted it. I was going to die in this small gray room. My body would be disposed of, my wife would be told I had died of illness, and the world would move on. A profound, eerie calm settled over me. The hunger pains had long since vanished, replaced by this strange, numb detachment. The thirst was a distant memory. I felt myself drifting away, the edges of my consciousness softening and blurring. The dim light from the ceiling seemed to grow faint, as if receding down a long, dark tunnel. This is it, I thought. This is the end. I closed my eyes, not to sleep, but to welcome the final darkness. I had reached the absolute zero of hope. I had become the statistic. I had been erased. And in that total, complete, and utter silence, a silence not just of sound, but of spirit, it happened. It did not come from outside. There was no angelic choir, no blast of light from heaven. The miracle began times inside asterisks, a point of warmth ignited in the very center of my being, in the place where the emptiness had taken root. It was not the feverish, false heat of a body in crisis. It was a deep, solid, profound warmth, like a small sun had been kindled in my spirit. It was a sensation of pure, unadulterated times life asterisk. It began to spread, slowly, deliberately, without any urgency. It moved up my spine, a wave of vitality pushing back the cold. It flowed into my chest, and the crushing weight on my lungs simply vanished. It radiated down my limbs into my fingers and toes, which I had not felt properly in days. As this warmth spread, the pain began to recede. Not all at once, but like a tide going out. The deep burning ache in my kidneys faded to a dull throb, then to a memory, then to nothing. The leaden weakness in my muscles was being replaced by a gentle, steady strength. It was not a surge of adrenaline, it was a fundamental restoration. I took a breath. It was a deep, full, expanding breath, the first one I had taken in weeks, that did not catch in my throat or cause a stab of pain. The air itself felt different, rich, and alive, and charged with a presence I could not see but could feel with every fiber of my being. I opened my eyes. The cell was the same. The grim walls, the dirty floor, the dim, relentless bulb, but I was not the same. The mental fog, the terrifying hallucinations, they were gone. My mind was clear, sharply, lucidly, impossibly clear. I felt clean, purged. I pushed myself up onto my elbows. There was no dizziness, no wave of nausea. I sat up, then, slowly, I stood on my feet. I felt the solid concrete beneath me. I felt steady. I looked at my hands. They were still skeletal. The skin stretched taut over bone, but the tremors had stopped. The swelling in my ankles was gone. This was not a temporary rally, the final flicker of a candle before it goes out. This was someone relighting the wick. This was a reversal, a quiet, internal, physiological miracle. My body had been failing, and now was being sustained, not by bread, not by water, but by a grace that was defying every single law of nature. I was not just surviving. I was being rebuilt from the inside out. I was not just a prisoner in a cell. I was a living testament to a power that could rewrite reality itself. I began to weep, not tears of pain or self-pity, but tears of overwhelming, stupefying awe. God had not abandoned me in the silence. He had been waiting for the exact moment when all my strength, all my hope, all my time, self-times was gone, so that his power could be made perfect in my absolute weakness. He had let me hit the bottom so I would know, without a shadow of a doubt, that it was his hand that lifted me up. The warmth that flooded my being was unlike any physical sensation I'd ever known. It was not the heat of a fever which burns and confuses. This was a clean, penetrating warmth that originated from the very core of my spirit, as if a tiny star had been ignited within the void of my soul. It pulsed with a gentle, rhythmic certainty, a slow and deliberate wave that began to radiate outward. I felt it move up my spine, vertebra by vertebra, not as a shock, but as a soothing balm, unknotting a tension I had carried for a lifetime. It flowed into my chest, and the icy fist that had been clenched around my heart simply released. A profound sense of peace, heavier and more substantial than the despair it replaced, settled deep within me. This was not an emotion, it was a state of being. It was a peace that defied the circumstance, that mocked the concrete and the steel and the deliberate cruelty of my captors. As this wave of restorative energy reached my limbs, the physical changes became undeniable. The deep, grinding ache in my kidneys, which had been a constant, terrifying companion, began to recede. It didn't just lessen, it was systematically dismantled. The pain faded from a roaring fire to a dull ember, and then to cold, silent ash. The leaden weakness that had made lifting my head an ordeal was replaced by a gentle, steady strength. It was not the explosive power of adrenaline, but the solid, reliable strength of a well-anchored tree. I slowly, deliberately flexed the fingers of my right hand. There was no tremor, the skin was still stretched taut over the bone, but the weakness was gone. The swelling in my ankles and feet had completely vanished, the skin no longer tight and shiny, but slack and normal. I wiggled my toes against the cold floor, feeling each one individually, a simple act that days ago would have been impossible. But the most startling transformation was occurring in my mind. The psychic fog that had descended, the horrifying hallucinations that had been my only companions, they evaporated. It was as if a window, thick with grime and frost, had been wiped perfectly clean. My thoughts, which had been a chaotic, terrified jumble, snapped into a clarity that was almost painful. I could think in complete structured sentences again. I could remember scripture not as desperate fragmented pleas, but with their full context and meaning. I recalled the words from Isaiah, "But they who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint." I had always understood this as a metaphor. Now I knew it was a literal physical promise. I was being renewed. I was being remade. I took a breath. It was a deep, full, expanding breath that filled my lungs to their very bottom. The stale, foul air of the cell tasted different. It was no longer the air of death and decay, but simply air, a neutral medium through which I was being given life. I held the breath for a moment, savoring the capacity, the sheer mechanics of it. I exhaled slowly, and it felt like I was releasing the last of the poison that had been killing me. I opened my eyes, and though the cell was the same grim space, my perception of it had fundamentally altered. The walls were just walls. The door was just a door. They were temporary structures, incapable of containing what was now happening inside of me. The real prison had not been made of concrete, but of despair, and its gates had just been blown off their hinges. I pushed myself up from the concrete slab. There was no dizziness, no swimming vision, no frantic pounding of my heart. The movement was fluid and controlled. I sat on the edge of the slab for a long moment, just feeling the solidity of my own body, the quiet hum of life restored. Then I stood. My legs held me. They were thin and frail, but they were steadfast. I took a step, then another. I walked the 3 paces to the wall, placed my hand against the cold, damp concrete, and turned around. I was walking. I was a man who had been on the threshold of death, now pacing his cell, not in a frantic search for escape, but in a quiet, awe-filled exploration of his own resurrection. The miracle was not that I was being broken out of this prison. The miracle was that the prison was losing its power over me while I was still firmly within its walls. I was still captive, but I was for the first time truly, utterly free. This new state of being was not a transient surge. It held. As minutes bled into hours, the warmth did not diminish. It stabilized into a constant, humming vitality at my core, a divine engine idling within my spirit. I continued to pace my cell, not with the frantic energy of a caged animal, but with the deliberate gait of a man surveying a territory that had once defeated him. I tested my body, not with fear, but with a curious, reverent awe. I would stretch my arms toward the low ceiling, feeling the pull of muscle and tendon, not with pain, but with a grateful awareness of their function. I would stand on the balls of my feet and hold the position, feeling a strength that was clearly not my own. The hunger was gone, not suppressed, not ignored, but utterly absent. The gnawing void that had defined my existence for weeks had been filled with something else, something that rendered food irrelevant. The thirst was a memory. My mouth was moist, my throat clear. It was as if I was being sustained by a direct intravenous drip of pure life, bypassing all natural systems. This physical impossibility forced a profound spiritual reckoning. My intellect, now razor sharp, wrestled with the evidence. I was a man of reason. I believed in cause and effect. I knew the caloric requirements for human survival, the irreversible stages of organ failure. Every scientific law I had ever learned screamed that what was happening was impossible. Yet here I stood. My body was a laboratory, and the results were undeniable. This was not a denial of science, it was a transcendence of it. God was not breaking his own physical laws. He was operating on a higher plane where a different set of principles applied, principles of grace, of sovereignty, of a power that could feed 5,000 with a few loaves and fishes, or sustain a starving pastor with nothing but his will. The God I had accused of silence had been speaking the entire time, not in words, but in the silent, patient language of molecular biology, holding my cells together until the moment he chose to demonstrate his lordship over them. Tears began to stream down my face, but they were not tears of weakness. They were the overflow of a soul that had been filled beyond its capacity. They were tears of gratitude so immense it felt like a physical pressure in my chest. I wept for my wife, hoping somehow she could feel that I was alive. I wept for my captors, a sudden, startling pang of pity for them, trapped in their small, cruel system that could not account for this. I wept for the arrogant man I had been, the professor who thought he understood the boundaries of reality. That man was gone. He had died on the concrete floor. What remained was someone new, someone humble, someone who had been shown the utter futility of his own strength and the infinite reservoir of God's. I found myself laughing, a soft, breathy sound that echoed strangely in the silent cell. It was laughter of sheer, unadulterated joy. The absurdity of it, the glorious, magnificent absurdity. The Iranian government, with its vast intelligence apparatus, its prisons, its interrogators, had thrown everything it had at me. And God had countered not with an army, not with a lightning bolt, but with a quiet internal restoration. He had turned their most potent weapon, my own body, into the very evidence of his power. It was a checkmate move of divine genius. I wasn't just being saved, I was being vindicated. My faith, which had felt so fragile, had been proven to be the most substantial, unshakable reality in the entire universe. I knew this was not the end. This miracle was not for me alone. It had a purpose that extended beyond these walls. The restoration of my body was merely the first act. I could feel a new sense of mission settling over me, a calm, unwavering resolve. I was no longer a victim waiting for a verdict. I was a witness preparing my testimony. I looked at the steel door, no longer with dread, but with a sense of anticipation. I knew it would open. I knew Javad would return. And when he did, he would not be facing a broken, dying man. He would be facing a living miracle. He would be confronting a truth his ideology could not process, a power his state could not control. The ignition inside me was complete. I was alive, I was whole, and I was ready. Let them come. The first crack in their immutable system came with the sound of the food slot scraping open. It was the same time as always, a mechanical gesture performed without thought. The guard's hand, holding the dry piece of times sangak times bread, appeared in the opening. But the routine ended there. I was not huddled on the slab, nor was I slumped against the wall. I was standing in the center of the small cell, calm and upright, my hands loose at my sides. I turned my head and looked directly at the guard's face, which was half visible in the narrow opening. His eyes, which I had only ever seen glazed with boredom or contempt, widened into perfect circles of shock. He froze, his arms still extended into my cell, the bread held in a limp grip. He was not seeing a prisoner, he was seeing a ghost, a walking contradiction to a fundamental law of his world. A man who should be dead or delirious was not just alive, but present, conscious, and radiating a disquieting stillness. He did not say a word. With a sharp, involuntary intake of breath, he yanked his arm back as if burned. The bread fell to the floor, forgotten. The metal slot slammed shut with a force that echoed like a gunshot in the silence. I heard his footsteps, not the usual lazy shuffle, but a frantic, stumbling retreat down the corridor. The sound was a symphony to my ears. It was the sound of their certainty breaking. I left the bread on the floor. I felt no urge to pick it up. Its presence was a testament to a reality I no longer inhabited. I was being fed from a different source, and the sight of that desperate, discarded offering filled me not with hunger, but with a profound sense of pity for the world that believed it was enough. I did not have to wait long. Perhaps 20 minutes passed, each one stretching out, thick with anticipation. Then I heard the distinct, quicker footsteps of someone with authority. The bolt on the door clanged back, a harsh metallic sound that had once inspired dread. Now it felt like a curtain rising on a stage I was prepared for. The door swung open and Javad stood there. He did not step inside. He filled the doorway, his neat frame a sharp silhouette against the fluorescence of the hall. His eyes, those cold, analytical instruments, scanned me from head to toe. I saw his gaze catch on my posture, on my hands, which were no longer trembling, and finally on my face. The calm, superior mask he always wore was gone. In its place was a raw, unvarnished confusion. The skin around his eyes was tight, his lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. He was recalculating, and every calculation was yielding an error. "They are releasing you," he said. His voice was the same flat tone, but I heard the faintest tremor beneath it, a vibration of strain, like a wire pulled too tight. He gestured vaguely with one hand, a dismissive, worldly gesture. "There's pressure, diplomatic noise. From the British, the Canadians, your followers online." He said the words, but they were empty, a script he was reciting because it was the only script he had. The international pressure was a convenient fiction, a face-saving narrative for the regime's paperwork. We both knew it was irrelevant. It was not the reason he was standing here, his composure fractured. It was not the reason he could not bring himself to meet my gaze for more than a second at a time. He took a single hesitant step into the cell. The space felt suddenly smaller, charged with the collision of two incompatible realities. He was close enough now that I could see the pulse beating rapidly in his neck. He smelled of cheap cologne and stale cigarette smoke, the smells of a mundane world that was suddenly terrifyingly inadequate. "The doctor examined you," he said, his voice dropping, becoming almost confidential, as if we were co-conspirators in a secret. "It was 2 days ago. He was very clear. He said your kidneys were failing. He said you had at most 48 hours. He wrote it in your file." Javad's eyes were locked on mine now, desperate for an answer, any answer that could fit into the box of his understanding. "You should be dead. You should be in a coma. You should not be able to stand, let alone..." He trailed off, his hand fluttering in a gesture that encompassed my entire being, my clarity, my stillness, my very aliveness. He was not asking me a question. He was stating a series of facts that had until this moment been the unshakable foundation of his universe. He was a man of systems, of cause and effect, of state power and biological inevitability, and I was living, breathing proof of a system he had never accounted for. I was the unexplainable variable that had just crashed his entire mainframe. He stood there, waiting for me to say something, to offer some explanation, to gloat, to preach. I remained silent. The miracle needed no defense. It simply was. My presence was the argument, and it was one his logic could not refute. The silence between us stretched, becoming a tangible thing. It was not my silence of defeat, but a silence of supreme, unassailable fact. I had nothing to say to Javad because the evidence was standing before him, breathing the same air, occupying the same space. My very existence was the rebuttal to every one of his assertions. I watched the struggle play out on his face, the twitch of a muscle in his jaw, the way his eyes darted around the cell as if searching for a hidden source of food or water. A trick, a logical explanation his mind could latch onto. He found nothing. There was only me and the terrifying, inexplicable truth I embodied. Finally, with a sound that was half sigh, half groan, he turned on his heel and left. The door closed, but this time, the bolt was thrown with less conviction, a hollow metallic whisper compared to its former definitive slam. The shift once initiated was irreversible. The next time the food slot opened, it was not the same guard. This one was older, his face a roadmap of weary lines. He did not look at me directly, but his eyes flickered toward me with a nervous, almost superstitious anxiety. He did not just shove a piece of bread through. He placed a full bowl of watery lentil soup and a larger portion of bread on the small ledge inside the slot, a meal I had not seen in weeks. Then he did something extraordinary. He hesitated and then quickly slid a second, smaller cup of water through the opening before swiftly closing the slot. It was not much, but in the economy of Evin Prison, it was a fortune. It was an offering, an apology, an acknowledgement of a power they feared and could not understand. This new pattern held. The guards, who had been my tormentors, became my silent, fearful attendants. Their cruelty was replaced by a wary, bewildered reverence. When they brought the food, they avoided my eyes, their movements hurried and subdued. They no longer spat or uttered curses. The atmosphere in the corridor outside my cell changed. The loud, brutal banter between the guards ceased when they passed my door. Their footsteps would soften, as if they were walking past a shrine, a place where the normal rules did not apply. I was no longer just a prisoner. I was a phenomenon, a living relic. The man who should be dead. The silence that had once been filled with my despair was now filled with their unspoken questions and their mounting fear. I could feel their confusion like a vibration in the air. They had been trained to break men through violence, deprivation, and psychological pressure. They had a manual for that. But they had no manual for this. How do you break a man who has already been broken and then put back together by an unseen hand? How do you threaten a man who has already stared into the abyss of death and found it filled with light? Their entire system of control was predicated on the fragility of the human body and spirit. I was now demonstrating a shocking immunity to both. I was living proof that their power had severe, humiliating limits. Days passed in this strange, suspended state. I was still a captive, but the captivity had lost its teeth. I spent my time in prayer and meditation, not as a desperate plea, but as a joyful communion. I thanked God for the silence, for the peace, for the steadfast warmth in my core that never faded. I was like Daniel in the lion's den, the beast still present, but their mouths held shut by a divine command. The lions in my den wore uniforms and carried keys, but they were just as muzzled by a power they could not see. Then, one evening, the door opened again. It was Javad. He did not come for an interrogation. He stood there, holding a clean, gray blanket, a stark contrast to the thin, filthy rag I had been using. He did not speak. He simply stepped into the cell, placed the folded blanket on the end of the concrete slab, and stood back. He looked at me, and for the first time I saw not confusion or fear, but a deep, unsettling contemplation. He was studying me not as a problem to be solved, but as a mystery to be comprehended. The order for your release came from a very high level, he said, his voice low. The diplomatic pressure was significant. He paused, and I knew the next words were the only ones that truly mattered to him. But that is not why you are leaving this cell alive. He looked at the blanket, then back at me. You are leaving because you were already dead. And now you are not. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a man finally conceding the defeat that was also for him a terrifying revelation. The system has no protocol for this. He turned and left, leaving the door slightly ajar. I could hear his footsteps fading down the hall, slower and heavier than before. I looked at the clean blanket. It was not just fabric. It was a white flag, a surrender. The final, unspoken confirmation that the shift was complete. They were not releasing me because they wanted to. They were releasing me because they no longer knew what to do with me. I had become, in their eyes, too holy to hold or too dangerous to keep. Perhaps there was no difference. The clean blanket was the first domino to fall. Its presence on my slab was a signal, a breach in the unyielding protocol of Evin. The next morning, the food slot opened, and instead of the usual hurried, fearful hand, I saw the young guard's face fully. He looked at me, his eyes wide, and then he did something that stole the breath from my lungs. He bowed. It was a quick, jerky, almost imperceptible dip of his head, but it was unmistakable. It was not a bow of respect for me, Dariush the man. It was a bow of terror and awe directed at the power that sustained me. He was acknowledging the unseen, the force that had rewritten the rules of his world right before his eyes. He left not just a standard meal, but an extra piece of fruit, a single bruised apple. It might as well have been a jewel. I picked it up, its weight and solidity a wonder in my hand. I did not eat it. I held it. A tangible symbol of a revolution happening in the heart of the world's most oppressive system. The change became systemic, environmental. The very air in the prison wing seemed to shift. The constant, low-grade hum of menace that had permeated the stone walls began to recede, replaced by a watchful, uneasy silence. Guards who had once strutted past my cell now walked with a hesitant, almost reverent gait. Their eyes, when they dared to glance through the slot, held not contempt but a kind of superstitious fear. I heard two of them arguing in hushed, tense whispers outside my door one evening. "I told you, he does not eat the bread. I see it. He leaves it." Nonsense. No one can. I have seen it. He moves. He stands. He prays. His eyes, they are clear. Too clear. The second guard made a warning gesture, a subtle flick of his fingers against his chest, an ancient superstition resurfacing to combat a modern impossibility. They were men trained in an ideology of absolute state control, yet they were being reduced to primal, fearful gestures by a miracle they could not report, could not explain, and could not ignore. I had become a ghost in their machine, a glitch in their reality, and the only way they knew how to respond was with a terrified, silent reverence. The pinnacle of this strange new hierarchy came with the doctor's visit. 2 days after Javad's last visit, the door opened and a thin, elderly man with a nervous demeanor entered carrying a small medical bag. A guard stood watch outside, his face a mask of stern apprehension. The doctor did not speak. He gestured for me to sit on the slab. His hands trembled slightly as he took my wrist to check my pulse. His fingers were cold against my skin. He frowned, his brow furrowing. He checked again, counting slowly, his lips moving silently. He then produced a stethoscope, its metal disc icy against my chest. He listened for a long time, moving it to different locations, the frown on his face deepening into a crevice of pure bewilderment. "Your heart," he finally muttered, almost to himself. "It is strong, very strong." He looked at my eyes with an otoscope, shone a light into my throat. He had me stand, and he checked the swelling in my ankles, pressing his thumb into the skin where the pits of edema had been. There was nothing. He stared at the unmarked skin, then back at my face, his professional composure completely shattered. "This is not possible," he whispered, the words escaping him like a confession. "The report, renal failure, the symptoms were definitive." He packed his instruments with clumsy, hurried movements, unable to look at me anymore. He signed a paper on his clipboard with a frantic scribble and almost fled the cell. He had come to certify a dying man and had instead found a medical anomaly. His science had no box to check for resurrection. This was the echo. The miracle was not a single event that ended when my body was restored. It was a living, breathing, ongoing phenomenon whose sound waves were reverberating through the prison, shaking the foundations of every person it touched. It was in the guard's bow, the extra apple, the whispered arguments, the doctor's shattered diagnosis. They had tried to erase me, but instead, my presence had become amplified, magnified by a divine speaker. I was more powerful in that cell as a captive than I had ever been as a free man. My silent testimony was dismantling their world brick by brick, and they were handing me the tools. The victory was not in my impending release. The victory was in the terror and awe in the eyes of my captors. The victory was in the echo. The bureaucracy of my release was as cold and impersonal as the bureaucracy of my arrest. There were no apologies, no explanations. It was a transaction, the closing of a file. A different guard, one I had never seen before, came to my cell. His demeanor was strictly professional, devoid of the fear or reverence the others had shown. He handed me the clothes I was arrested in. They hung from my frame like a scarecrow's rags, the belt loops gaping, the shirt collar swimming around my neck. As I dressed, I felt the coarse fabric against my skin, a sensation from a past life. Then he presented me with a small cardboard box. Inside was my wallet, my watch, and my wedding ring. I picked up the ring, the cool, familiar metal feeling heavier than I remembered. I struggled to slide it onto my finger, my hand trembling now not from weakness, but from a surge of emotion so powerful it threatened to buckle my knees. It was the reclamation of my identity, the reconnection of a chain they had tried to sever. I was Dariush Vahidi, husband, professor, pastor, once again. I was led through the maze of corridors, each step taking me further from the tomb I had inhabited. The guards at their stations did not look at me. It was a deliberate, concerted avoidance. They stared at their papers, at the walls, at anything but the walking contradiction passing them by. They were erasing me from their memory, purging the uncomfortable anomaly from their system. We reached the final office. A clerk behind a thick pane of glass slid a document through a slot. "Sign here," he said, not looking up, and here. The form was a release order. The stated reason was lack of evidence. The lie was so blatant, so transparent, it was almost comical. I signed my name, the pen feeling foreign in my hand. The script was shaky, but it was mine. The clerk stamped the paper with a definitive thud, a sound that echoed with finality. A heavy metal door buzzed and then swung open ahead of me. I stepped through it, and the world exploded. The sunlight of a Tehran afternoon was a physical blow, so bright and sharp it felt like needles in my eyes. I raised a hand to shield my face, blinking against the painful, glorious glare. The noise was the next assault, the chaotic symphony of traffic, car horns, distant voices, the buzz of a city alive and indifferent. The air was thick with the smells of exhaust, dust, and cooking food, a rich tapestry of sensations after the sterile death smell of my cell. I stood on the sidewalk, just outside the grim outer wall of Evin, a free man. I took a deep, shuddering breath, filling my lungs with the dirty, beautiful air of freedom. I was out. But I was not the same man who had gone in. I turned, compelled by a force I did not understand. Parked a short distance away was a nondescript black sedan. The passenger window was down, and inside I saw him, Javad. He was not in his uniform, but wore a simple plain shirt. He was not looking at the prison gate, but straight ahead through the windshield. His hands rested on the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He must have felt my gaze, because he slowly, very slowly turned his head. Our eyes met across the dusty space. No words passed between us. There was nothing to say. His face was a landscape of quiet ruin. The certainty, the cold logic, the absolute power, it was all gone. In its place was a hollowed-out contemplation, the look of a man who has seen the foundations of his world crack and can never unsee it. He did not nod, he did not smile. He simply held my gaze for a long, profound moment. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition that the system had failed and a greater one had prevailed. Then he turned back, started the car, and pulled away, merging into the traffic and disappearing. I stood there, watching the space where his car had been. The echo was not confined to the prison walls. It had followed me out. It was in Javad's defeated posture, in his final, silent look. The miracle had not just saved a life. It had, I hoped, begun to save a soul. The victory was not just in my freedom, but in the crack I had seen in the armor of my chief tormentor. He was now carrying his own prison with him, a cell of doubt and wonder, and I knew the echo of what he had witnessed would haunt him for the rest of his days. I turned my back on Evin and began to walk, a thin, ragged man in ill-fitting clothes, but filled with a light that no darkness would ever be able to extinguish. The walk away from Evin Prison was the longest journey of my life. Each step was a negotiation between two worlds. My body, still frail but supernaturally sustained, moved through the noisy, chaotic streets of Tehran. My spirit, however, was lagging behind, still processing the silence of the cell, the warmth of the miracle, the echo of my captor's fear. The city rushed around me, a river of life oblivious to the tomb I had just escaped. Cars honked, vendors shouted, and people hurried about their lives. The normalcy of it all was jarring, almost offensive. How could the world be so unchanged when I had been utterly unmade and remade inside? I felt like a ghost walking among the living, seeing everything through a veil of profound, unshakable knowledge. I did not go home immediately. I was not ready. I found a small, secluded park and sat on a bench, watching the leaves rustle in the wind. I needed to breathe. I needed to feel the sun on my skin without the filter of a barred window. I needed to remember what it was to be a person in the world, not just a number in a system. I looked at my hands, at the wedding ring now firmly on my finger. I thought of Lale. A wave of emotion, so powerful it was dizzying, washed over me. I was going to see my wife. The hope of that moment had been the tiny, fragile flame I had shielded in the deepest part of my soul during the darkest days. Now it was a roaring fire, terrifying in its intensity. What would she see when she looked at me? The man she married, or the ghost that had returned? I finally gathered the courage to hail a taxi. I gave the driver my address, my voice a rough, unfamiliar sound. He glanced at me in the rearview mirror, taking in my gaunt face and ill-fitting clothes, but said nothing. The drive was a blur of familiar landmarks that felt like artifacts from a dream. When the taxi pulled up to our apartment building, my heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic living drum. I paid the driver and stepped out, my legs feeling weak for the first time since the miracle. I stood on the sidewalk, looking up at the window of our home. The curtain was drawn. I didn't know if she would be there. I didn't know if she had been forced to move. I didn't know anything. I walked into the building, the familiar smell of the hallway, a punch to the gut. I climbed the stairs, each step an eternity. I reached our door. I raised my hand to knock, but my fingers hesitated. What if she had given up hope? What if the man who returned was a stranger to her? I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and let my knuckles fall against the wood. The sound was deafening in the silence. I heard footsteps from inside, slow, hesitant. Then the lock turned, the door opened, just a crack, held by a security chain, and I saw her, Lale. Her eyes, wide and fearful, peered through the opening. They scanned my face, and for a heart-stopping moment there was no recognition, only the caution of a woman who had been living in fear for months. Then her gaze locked with mine. Her eyes widened, the fear dissolving into a confusion so profound it looked like pain. "Dariush," she whispered, her voice breaking on the second syllable. I could only nod, my throat too tight for words. A sob escaped her, a raw guttural sound of disbelief and dawning joy. Her hands fumbled with the chain, her fingers shaking so badly she could barely slide it open. The door swung wide, and she stood there, her hands flying to her mouth, her body trembling. She was more beautiful than any hallucination, any memory. She was real. We stood for a long moment, just staring at each other, two survivors of a shipwreck meeting on a distant shore. Then she rushed forward and threw her arms around me, burying her face in my chest. I held her, my thin arms wrapping around her, feeling the solid, wonderful reality of her. I could feel her sobs racking her body, and I held her tighter, my own tears finally falling, mingling with her hair. We stood there in the doorway, clinging to each other, two broken pieces finally finding their way back to form a whole. I was home. The journey was over. The return was complete. The days and weeks that followed were a different kind of journey. My body continued its slow, natural healing, but the divine sustenance, that inner warmth, remained a constant, humming reminder of the promise that I would never be forsaken. I ate and drank again, but each meal was a sacrament, a tangible grace I would never again take for granted. Lale would watch me with eyes that held a mixture of overwhelming joy and a lingering shadow of terror. She would reach out in the middle of the night, her hand finding mine, just to confirm I was still there. We did not speak much of the details at first. Words were too small. Our healing was in the silence, in the shared pot of tea in the morning, in the simple, miraculous act of being together. But a fire had been lit in my soul, a purpose that went beyond the walls of our apartment. I was not just a husband who had returned. I was a witness who had been sent back. The mission I felt in the cell had followed me into freedom. I began to write, my hand steady, the words flowing with a clarity I had never known. I wrote my testimony, every agonizing detail of the starvation, the despair, and the precise, undeniable moment of the miracle. I described the warmth, the clarity, the strength. I wrote of the guard's bow, the doctor's confusion, and Javad's shattered ideology. This was not just my story anymore, it was evidence. It was a document of a collision between two kingdoms and the resounding victory of the one that holds the power of life itself. One evening, I felt the chapter was complete. I showed it to Lale. She read it in silence, her tears falling onto the pages, smudging the ink in places. When she finished, she looked at me, her face radiant with a fierce, proud light. "The world must hear this," she said, her voice firm. "This is why you came back." She was right. My return was not for comfort, but for proclamation. The purpose of my suffering was now clear. It was to forge a testimony that could shatter the despair of others, a story that screamed into the silence of a suffering world, that God is real, He is present, and His power is absolute. And so I record this now for you. My story is not unique because of my suffering. Suffering is universal. My story is unique because of my rescue. They tried to break me with the most absolute weapon they had, my own body. And God showed them, and He showed me, that my body, my life, my every breath belongs to Him. He sustains it by His will, and no power on earth can extinguish it until He says it is done. The message of my return is this: your prison may not be made of concrete and steel. It may be sickness, debt, addiction, or a despair that feels as absolute as my starvation. But hear me, please. When you reach the end of yourself, when your strength is gone and your hope is dead, that is the very moment He's waiting for. That is the moment He can do His greatest work. Your failure is not the end. It is the prerequisite for His victory. They thought they could erase me, but God used their erasure to write a message of eternal life in a place of death. The cost of following Christ was everything I had. The reward was a truth that saves. I am a living testament that the Gospels are alive, that Christ's power is not a historical artifact, but a present active force for those who call on Him in spirit and in truth. Return to that truth. Cling to it. It is the only thing that can never, ever be taken from you. This testimony is my life's purpose now. This channel, Echoes of Return, is the vessel for that purpose. I have shared my soul with you. I have held nothing back. If this story has echoed in your spirit, if it has sparked a memory of God's faithfulness or ignited a new flicker of hope, then my suffering has found its ultimate meaning. Do not let this echo fade. Subscribe to this channel. Share this video with one person who is in their own prison, who needs to hear that the door is not locked forever. Do not wait. The time for silence is over. The time for return is now.